But without further ado, I want to return back Dr. Ana María Hernández, who will introduce the next panel.
Thank you, Hugo, and thank you, Will, for the great music that you have provided throughout the day. We are now moving to the second panel, and the theme of our conference is building bridges, not only with other programs with CUNY, but also with other disciplines. And you may remember that this morning's presentation, when Professor de la Fuente had a chart of the number of theses in different fields, the biggest number was in history, and the smallest number so far was in art, but that is changing, and this panel is evidence of that. We are proud to have with us Professor Bárbaro Martínez Ruiz, who is signing in from Oxford, and our dear friends Iliana, Cepero, Amador, and Rojo Robles Mejías. And we are fortunate and proud to have Dr. Shelly Eversley from Baruch College moderating the panel. Professor Shelly Eversley is a Provost Faculty Fellow and Interim Chair of Black and Latinx Studies at Baruch College. She is also Faculty Co-Director of the Andrew Mellon Foundation, a Transformative Learning in the Humanities project at CUNY. She is a professor of African American literature, and she is the author of The Real Negro, The Question of Authenticity in 20th Century African American Literature. Let us welcome Professor Shelly Eversley, who will introduce the members of our panel. Thank you, Shelly.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Welcome to this panel, Afro-Latin American Visual Arts and Aesthetics, that is organized by, among others, Hugo Fernandez and Ana María Hernández, and supported by so many of our colleagues at LaGuardia Community College. Thank you for your incredible work and for your commitment to Latinx and Latin American studies here at CUNY. Many thanks also to our colleagues across CUNY and beyond. This opportunity to learn, collaborate, and to build bridges has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities. This panel's presenters, in various stages of their very distinguished careers, all work in overlapping areas of visual art, poetics, and film. After all of their presentations, we will have time for questions and conversations. You are welcome to post your questions using the Q&A function in the lower center position on your screen. And the chat function is open to everyone. You are also very welcome to post your positive vibrations there. And finally, please mute your microphones so we can hear the panelists without distractions. I'm going to very briefly introduce our first panelist, Bárbaro Martínez Ruiz, who is the Leverhulme Distinguished Professor and Senior Fellow at St. Anthony's College at the University at Oxford. He's also the Tanner-Opperman Chair of Art History in honor of Roy Sieber at Indiana University. His presentation is called Kongo Graphic Writing. Welcome, Professor Martínez Ruiz, please.
I cannot link the video.
Jamie?
The host, okay, start my video. Perfect. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon for everyone. I would like to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities, the LaGuardia Community College, and CUNY for this incredible opportunity and the invitation. And Ana María Hernández, Shelly Eversley, Hugo Fernandez, Marixa Acero, Joseph Tavares. And also I would like to dedicate this lecture to my two co-panelists, Iliana Cepero and Rojo Robles Mejías. what I try to present today, in a way, kind of feel responding to an event that took place yesterday at Harvard. That the central question was about the African traditions. Try to find the share. Try to find the PowerPoint now. I'm sorry. Can you see the presentation?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. Okay. In these 20 minutes, I will introduce the assistance of graphic writing system in that emerged from around 16th century, 17th century in the Congo, and being continued practiced by Congolese descent and other Africans that have been transported as a slave to the diaspora into the Caribbean, Latin America, specifically in Cuba. What I want to just kind of show the area, get a sense in Central Africa, where is the Congo located? What is right now the northern part of Angola and the southern part of Democratic Republic of the Congo, just to get a sense there. And the first things I wanted to kind of show here in these slides is the incredible diversity of cultural groups there are around this particular area that made it very difficult to try to understand the way in which this tradition come together and how they interact and how they develop later in the diaspora. And the first things I wanted to introduce that kind of we can see as a building block for the development of a graphic writing system is the idea of a cosmogram. A cosmogram as a principle have a kind of epistemological function, a conceptual framework that allow people to communicate through graphic aids. And the cosmograms I wanted to introduce today called the Kenga, and also they have a different names, Yowa, the Yowa, Luela, and in the diaspora in Cuba, they call the Four Winds. But the cosmograms can be understood as way that formulates the migration narrative, as a way the culture narrates the understandings and the place of a sense of origins, how they build their own identity. Also contains principle that they are embedded into the religious practice, no belief system in the religious practice, and also allowed to articulate the Congo worldview and understanding of their own moral philosophy and humanity. But here I just wanted to show in a kind of simple way the cosmogram will have the shape of a diamond or a circle split into equal part with a cross in the middle with equal arms. But we can see the upper part of the cosmogram that have a distinctive characteristics. We can think as the foundation of a cosmogram, the design of a triangle that allow the Congo people to understand concept around the spiritual, the physical, and the mental state of humans. And the second part of a combination of a triangle, an upside down triangle, that reverse, that could be specific associated with the ancestor or on the wall, underground world. And when you come together, these two triangles, they turn into diamonds and diamonds that allow to articulate pretty much the principle of the Congo religions. But here you can maybe see it in a more simple way, this idea of the world of the humans and the world of the spirits that kind of divide by this equal line in the middle, that the horizontal lines that have multiple names, Lunga or Kalunga, that also they have association, a specific association with the definition of gods, or Nsambi and Pungo, Tulendo. Also, one way to articulate this idea of a cosmogram, these dynamic implications of use as a cosmogram, that had to do with the way Bakongo people think about notion of humanity or beings in this world. And Bakongo believe we are a small sun that migrate through the horizon, and we born in position number 1. We become a teenager in position number 2. You can see the size of the sun start getting bigger. We become an adult in position number 3 on the zenith, and we die in position number 4. The cosmogram is pretty much a way to narrate or to tell our migration through our life, our development through society and through time, from the day we born and the time we die. And the cosmogram to have 2 important graphic elements, that horizontal lines that allow to divide these 2 realms, and it could be associated with the ocean, and a vertical line called mukula that allow to human to rise up, the ancestor to rise up, or human to communicate with ancestor down below, and both coming together into the notion of a crust that later been syncretized or associated with a Christian cross. And in right in the middle, that represents the village, human village, in the place in which we live, the place that take the most important events in our life, and our social organizations, societies, and our marriage and our commitment with other people. But just to give a sense of how important is in terms of a cosmogram, this is an example from a place called Luvu. And you can see the Dikenga cosmogram and the details on the right that have a specific name, Kalunga, the life come to assist on Earth. That is the actual meaning. And this particular site is from 14th, possible 15th century, according to Carbon 14's data. And as you can see now, that's the way you can codify this idea of a cosmogram, that number 1, insisting in important graphic elements, the cardinal points, the southern points called Musoni, that would be yellow ochre. After that, we move forward to black, that color, and after that will be red, that represent maturity, also is the color of transitions and ritual, and Luvemba, that could translate as a clarity or brightness. That would be the far left, that would be associated with the color white or gray. And not just the cardinal point are important, also the color codifications that kind of is completely in opposition to the Western notion of color. White represent depth of everything that had to do with passing to the other world, and black represent life itself, or the vitality of life, or the capacity of life of creating something. And you can see here this idea of what Robert Farris Thompson defined, the 4 moments of the suns, as the idea of a sun migrating through the skies, like we as humans migrate through our life, through time. But the idea of a cosmogram have 2 axes of the world. So the idea of a crossroads, 4 sections of the universe, or the microcosm of the world is another way you can see it. And you can use the cosmogram to understand the world as a whole, so you can understand your own personal. But the idea of Musoni, of the notion of writing, is very important because Musoni is the lower point in the cosmogram. That Musoni also had to do means to inscribe, and it had to do more with our biological identity, our DNA, that make us very distinctive from other human beings. That inscribing should be inscribing in yellow as a beginning of meanings, beginning of writing. But the 3 key principles that I would like to kind of use here to explain the Kongo religious system would be the Kongo cosmology, the Kongo moral philosophy, and the kinship. I think there are three elements that they are very distinctive of the Kongo religions. And when we think about the Kongo cosmology, it has three different components: the spiritual conceptualizations, the Bakulu, the ancestor, the physical place in which we live, Nzi, and emotional dimensions, humans, Muntu. The Kongo model philosophy has also three important concepts that are defined by these three different concepts: the idea of a human body, Nitu, the idea of tangible life, Menga, Muela, and the notion of invisible spirits, Mpeve. It's the life that resides after we die, the life that continues after we lost our physical quality. And the last one would be the kinship. They have to do with the great ancestor, Nekalonga, those represent totality, Nempungu, vitality, Nembumba, discrete, the quiet moment of the creation sometime. This can be translated about specific character. Discrete is one of the most important elements that define the Kongo personality and character. But the Kongo cosmogram as a visual art have an interesting development. So we can see on the left the idea of a cosmogram can be represented as a chondrum on the left that have three stones called Makuku, Amatatu, Malembika, and Kongo. That is the representation of the actual cosmogram in a three-dimensional form, as a visual art, a sculpture. But you can see on the right is an example from Brazil that is translating this three-dimensional object of the cooking stones into the stone they can speaking on talking when they are running through the forest, more as a drawing in comparison with the one on the left as a sculpture. And we can see this idea of a chondrum as an important prototype that represents the cosmogram itself. It can be being notated by important European travelers. This is an example from Kawasi from 1667 representing the cauldron on the top left. On the bottom left is a cauldron used in the Kongo religion in Cuba called Palo Monte Mayombe, one of the branch that used to embed the vitalities that give meaning to the Kongo religions, and it's just a drawing on the right to just illustrate that. But the historical foundations just go back to long time, and I just want to kind of allow you to imagine and understand the time frames in about this particular area in Africa. And the oldest site we have here is from over 7,000 years ago, all the way to 2,596. And pretty much is what I tried to say, that we have example of a use of the cosmogram that later being co-opted by few scholars that think the cosmogram was something that came out of the influence with Christianity. But just an example from Kaningiri here from 7,840 years ago, the depiction of a cross, of the cosmogram that later became the Kenga. And you can see consequently the 4 different depictions of the saints even before European arrived to that particular area. In a way, these questions about hybridity or creolization is very tricky in this particular context, because we can see here continuity more between African religion within the context of Africa, in response to European religious practices. And this is just an example from my research. From 12, according to the Carbon 14 result, placed this in the 13th century. This is over 150 years before Diego Cao arrived to Mansa Kongo. Just to give it a sense, the complexity, not just in terms of the time frames, but understanding the use of these graphic systems also in terms of the aesthetic, the use of specific variations on the sand cross on the left, a simple one, and that diversity and complexity already being depicted in the early record from the 13th centuries. And it's just an example of a use from present day, 1999, this is from my research. You can see in front of the person the designs of a cosmogram that used to activate the asking for permission to dive into the pool inside that particular cave. This is the kind of use of that. But the Kongo continuity as a primary example of the cosmogram not just continue to be used through places like Cuba, Haiti, or Trinidad, Jamaica, or Brazil, or even in the United States, but just specifically in the United States, I just wanted to point out this particular example from 1753 from palmical plantations in South Carolina. And this is just an example of a particular set of terracotta practice produced by slaves in condition of slavery. And they're using the Dikenga signs in the bottom of this terracotta, and they are connected to a series of pools to collect this fresh water that embody the vitality of a spirit called Simbi. It's one of the most important Simbi, a spirit in the Congo tradition, back in Central Africa and through the diaspora. But what I try to say here is just not just a continuity of the designs of the Dikenga, also is a conceptual continuity of the idea of what the concept that being associated with the moral philosophy and the religions. This is just an example, a few examples from Cuba, just to get a sense the similarity in terms of aesthetic and also the perfect correlation with the conceptual framework. And just to give it a sense is not just that you can use a digital rendering of the Dikenga in a graphic form, also you can use material objects on seeds and organic materials to depict this cosmogram with the four moments that can be replaced a graphic element by organic material or rocks or feathers. Just give an example here, different allocations of meanings to each of the elements that can be used to understand to articulate meanings through these designs. But the writing function is very important, and I just want to show one example. There's an idea of communicating through verticality along the line. It's just a funerary terracotta from Dibondo. And just want to, these are X-rays I request that show in each of the level of a terracotta different depictions of meanings. And you can see one of them depicted someone who passed away, an important person, and they're celebrating ceremony called Ndembo that allow, it's like a cleansing ceremony that allow this person to come back as a leader. And this is the drawings, the illustration, the prints on the bottom is from Kawasi from the 17th century, and the X-ray from top from the pieces from the 19th century depicting exactly the same thing. But you can see not just the graphic, you can see the meanings that are articulated by the position and the gesture, the four different characters that in front facing the body. And you can see this idea of many problems, or joy and pleasure, honor, and spiritual cleansings, the meanings that are conveyed by the position of the body. And finish here, this idea of a gesture called Yangalele or Ayangalele in ecstasy. That is the next gesture in the narrative associated with the cross. You can see as a designs in other example here. And finish with this idea of privacy associated with a lizard, and final with the depictions of perfect beings called Muhungu that was created by humans, by God, I'm sorry. But here you can see the circle is the base of this terracotta that go back to Dikenga as a foundation for making up this particular ceramic pot, and associated with many different graphic variations. The circle straws on the bottom, the design I showed you before, the arch that allow you to cleansing before you come into your household, and the one represented for historical record. The art of writings is just wanted to show you a few examples among the Chokwe. Is the Sona is a Chokwe painting that you use on right in front of a community. When someone come into the village, they had to face those sand drawings, and the sand drawings allow you to understand what's happening in that village. It's just one example, a complex one that allow the Chokwe to articulate their own history, their own heritage and time and the moral philosophy. And here, just giving an example of the different meanings that I don't want to go into, but the important here, the actual drawings talk about location, talk about the ritual, talk about masquerade, performance, times, and legal body that rule this particular performance. And this is just an example from my research on rock painting that representing the Ndembo court. And in this case, you can think about the legal system that is deployed, all the principles, the legal system on the surface of the rock painting. And you can now, when you think about this idea of communicating to graphic forms, the terms in Kikongo is lusansu or sansa, that means to educate. The idea of writing had to do with the notion of transmitting knowledge and educating someone. In this case, the rock painting became a mirror of this moral philosophy and the legal system. And here you can see the relationship between these two, the ancient graphic rock painting on the left and the contemporary variation from 19th century on the right, from the Chokwe up to the present day. But the 3D writings is another important element that contributes to the development of the graphic writing in Cuba, and it's come from this lead part. And this is a tradition being designed by women when they have an issue, an argument with their husband, and the husband had to be able to decode what is depicted in that signs. And you can see here this particular traditions allows give so much agency to the women to tell, sometimes to these warning signs as what will happen with the relationship between husband and wife, and sometimes it's just a warning sign. But here you can see the idea of narrating in different register is very important. Number one is one set of articulation that had to do with the relationship between husband and wife. And the second one had to do with the statement that come from the wife and the statement that come from the husband. And you hear all the different depictions around in the circle. And you can see the husband, the wife guess what the husband wanted to say. And then she's kind of deployed all those meanings on the side of the husband. And the wife ideas as what is happening in the relationship will be kind of represented on the left next to her. And the final conclusion will be number 6, that you can see here all the different exchange and between and allow you to understand the gravity of the problems. But here is the final conclusion from the wife that had associated with a specific designs. I just wanted to kind of show you right away gunpowder containers, axe before, the water jar, this particular fruit, the empu and peba fruit, and the final is the seashell. And here is number 5 is the most important one, because it's that defines the final answer, the nature of the answer. She's saying she wanted to disintegrate the relationship between her and her partner or her husband. But here, when you think about something,
Bárbaro, please.
It's
5 minutes.
It's always fantastic to hear the woman, the wife, gets to have some agency in her relationship. And I wonder if we can, if Professor Martínez Ruiz, if you can wind down and we can carry on this conversation in the question and answer period.
Perfect. Yeah. I should finish here now.
That, if that's possible, that would be
Yeah,
great.
yeah. We'll finish it. Thank you.
It's fascinating. I'm very, you know, I wish that I could do more. We could do more of this. I could travel with you and see these things. Thank you very much,
You're welcome.
We have a presentation from Iliana Cepero Amador from Eugene Lang at the New School. She's in the Department of Visual Arts. Her presentation is called Jean-Baptiste Debret, Depicting the Colonial Subject in 19th Century Brazil. Welcome, Professor Amador.
Okay, thank you very much, Shelly, for the presentation, and hello, everyone. Thank you to Ana María Hernández and Hugo Fernandez for inviting me. Thank you for the National Endowment for the Arts. And this paper, I have to say, was inspired by a class that I took with Bárbaro when I was his student. He took a wonderful class of Art and Empire. And this was one of the papers I wrote for his class. And then I expanded, I did more research. And what I'm going to present today is a reduced version of a longer paper. Okay, so. So the play number 19, titled Blacks Returning from Hunting / Slave of a Naturalist by French painter Jean-Baptiste Debret, comprises two simultaneous narratives, that of four Black men coming from the forest, dressed in rags and displaying their hunting tools and their prey, and that of the slave of the white naturalist. This is the slave of the white naturalist, who has arrived from the city for his yearly meeting with the hunters to collect their exotic species for his knowledgeable European master. Wearing a tailored coat and a large straw hat adorned with butterflies, the slave holds in his left hand a living snake with a stick, as you can see here, and in his right hand carries a butterfly net. On his left shoulder, he supports a big sample case containing insects, and behind him, a Black child, his servant here, carries a top of plants. If the young boy is the slave of the naturalist slave, what sort of power dynamics is Debret representing in this illustration? So this play belongs to the second volume of A Picturesque and Historic Voyage to Brazil, or the sojourn of a French artist in Brazil from 1816 until 1831, a travelogue in which Debret portrays slavery and its overwhelming presence as essential to Brazil's economic structure and political governance. And a travelogue that often receives accolades by cultural critics and art historians, especially French and Brazilian. And I have to say that Bárbaro, as part of the class, took us to the university, to the library of the university, and we saw the album. So it was a great opportunity to see the album firsthand. In the most recent monograph on Debret, published in 2007, Brazilian historian Valeria Lima claims that his fundamental goal was to elaborate a historical and faithful discourse of Brazil in order to, and I quote, elevate Brazil to the category of a civilized nation in the midst of its developmental process, end of quote. Swiss art critic Jacques Linhart argues that Debret was fundamentally interested in urban populations because his revolutionary experience in France cast these urban residents as the engine of history, the agent through which nations are created. Other scholars, such as Brazilian art critic Carla Mari S. Oliveira, from her analysis of Debret's watercolors representing slaves, have concluded that although the artist depicted the great social stratification and the oppressive conditions for Brazilian slaves at the time, some of his portrayals of Blacks contributed to affirm their identity as individuals. As you can see, there is a sort of a consensus praising the race representation of Brazil. While these opinions merit attention, I will provide a different view by disentangling the concealed layers of fiction and theatricality that envelop Debret's rendering of a colonial world infected with the ills of slavery. I cast doubt on the general assertion that Debret's work manifests his belief in the country's great potential for economic and political power in the future. Instead, I argued that he was in fact an apologist for early Brazilian nationalism who legitimated through our imperial racial policies. I also argued that his ideas adhere to a language of progress and a vision of civilization as advancing through stages that allow for a democratic politage such as France in the 19th century to justify slaveholding practices and to construct a vision of a divinely harmonious universe. It's because this is the moment in which France is a big empire, is getting a lot of colonies in Africa. So there was, for me, that was a way for Debret to justify slavery. And through the mixture of the styles, the picturesque aesthetic and the cartographic tradition, Debret's plays reflect three fundamental impulses. First is a struggle to reconcile the general and the particular in his visual representations. Second, his reckoning of the complex politics between America and Europe, and above all, the uniqueness of Brazil as both a colony and an empire. And third, his efforts to accommodate the representation of slavery to this divine order of the universe. So to talk a little bit about Debret, he was born in 1768 in Paris into a family of artists. He was great nephew to the Rococo painter Francois Boucher, and during his adolescent years visited the atelier of another famous relative, the neoclassical artist Jacques-Louis David, with whom he traveled to Rome. While there, he was influenced by the neoclassical theories of the German art historian and archaeologist Johann Joachim Winckelmann. In 1785, Debret enrolled in the French Academy of Fine Arts, and in 1806, he began a cycle of canvases on Napoleonic themes, for which he received a prestigious Napoleonic 10-year award, which cemented his reputation among French neoclassical painters. In other words, he was trained as a neoclassical painter, and we're going to see why he used the picturesque when he was living in Brazil. On January 22nd, 1816, Debret arrived in Rio as part of the French artistic mission. Joaquin Le Breton, former Secretariat of Fine Arts at the France Institute and director of the Louvre Museum at the time, organized a group of artists to found a Royal School of Sciences, Arts and Crafts, which later became the Imperial Academy of Fine Arts in Rio de Janeiro, the new capital of the Portuguese Kingdom. Le Breton convinced the exiled Portuguese royal family that French artists were ideally suited to construct and promote a civilized image of the new urban center where they had settled. Yes, because after Napoleon invasion of Portugal in 1807, the Braganza family fled to Brazil. And once in Rio, they established the capital of the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. And in 1822, the capital of the newly inaugurated Empire of Brazil, after which Emperor Dom Pedro I, heir to King João VI, declared independence from Portugal, and in the process commissioned the writing of the constitution that in 1824 would establish the Brazilian Empire as a unitary state. So in other words, Brazil was simultaneously a colony and an empire. Debret 3 volumes of A Picturesque Voyage, published in France between 1834 and 1839, contain 151 black and white lithographs made by Thierry Frères. The first tome focuses on the habits, arms, tools, and ornaments of the Indians. The second volume describes the customs and habits of civilized Brazilians, as he put it, and represents the daily urban life of Rio, mostly populated by slaves, and includes historical and geographical information about the country. And the last volume depicts political and religious history, studies the fine arts in the country, and also features some additional portrayals of Brazilian habits and lifestyles. Debret was to remain in the capital for 15 years until the abdication of Don Pedro I in 1831. Now, let's talk about, in the longer version of the paper, I analyzed 7 plays. Here, it's going to be 4 or so because of time. But well, in the introduction to the second volume, Debret recommends that his purpose is to, and I quote, describe the progressive march of civilization in Brazil in which everything rests on the slave's shoulders, end of quote. So this play number 23, Market on Balongo Street, and illustrates the moment at the slave market when a buyer from Minas Gerais, this character here, has decided to purchase a child selected from the group seated on the floor and is bargaining with the gypsy slave trader over here. Through his explanation of the play, Debret detailed that this market is a slave's first stop after arriving from Africa. He harshly criticizes gypsies, whom he calls, and I quote, Negroes dealers and true dealers of human flesh, end of quote. But Debret's apparent disgust toward these sellers seems to originate mainly not in the reprehensible nature of their business, but rather in their rogue behavior when performing transactions. Text and image serve strongly to advertise the business of slavery, including cautioning potential buyers to take precautions in order to avoid scams from either slaves or vendors. It warns that no slave should be purchased without the presence of a doctor capable of assessing their physical condition. Knowledgeable about the expensive value of these human commodities, Debret stresses the need for the customer to bring along a consulting expert to appraise them. He advises that this medical test should be meticulous, since Blacks, when they are more, between quotes, civilized, could be cunning in feigning physical or moral imperfections in order to put off the buyer. In this particular illustration, Debret has drawn the Blacks with almost unidentifiable facial features. Their saleable condition is emphasized by a cranial and facial homogeneity that contrasts markedly with the individualized features of both the gypsy and the white buyer. Colonized subjects, according to imperial views, bore the stamp of bodily and facial uniformity. Economic structure of slavery in Rio seemed to Debret noteworthy for its peculiar stratification and distinctions. In poor family in their house, Debret explains that this was a very wealthy family ruined by successive tragedies. When a rich family fell into unfortunate times, their first recourse was to sell off their smartest and healthiest slaves. According to Debret, a wise move, since they could be sold very profitably. A second stroke of bad luck would compel them to sell an additional number of useful slaves. Finally, facing bankruptcy, an owner would have no choice but to dispose of his oldest slaves. But happily, a loyal servant would always linger, allegedly pleased to obey her master regardless of circumstances. According to Debret, the female slave in this play spends the day offering her services as a water carrier for others in the city, and so contributes 6 or 8 coins a day to help support his family. So you can see the moment in which the slave is giving the coins to the young woman. The play elucidates the particular dynamics of early 19th century Brazilian urban life, in which a whole system known as escravos de ganho, or blacks for hire, operated as the core of Rio's economic activity, a hectic market of impromptu job transactions. Owning slaves and pimping them by putting them for hire in the streets was the most common investment and practice before the abolition of slavery, to the extent that even freed slaves were wont to buy their own slaves. Every white family, from the wealthiest to the poor ones, such as the one portrayed here, took advantage of these additional earnings from this less formal tier of economic activity. The system allowed whites to remain idle. Portuguese anthropologist Manuela Carneiro de Cunha points out that, and I quote, owning slaves was the most common investment, the most traded commodity, and a customary way of life. Blacks for Hire sheds light on the ubiquity of Blacks and mulattoes in Debret's images. An estimated of 406,000 free non-whites lived in 1798 in Rio de Janeiro, and by 1835, Black slaves amounted to around 46,000. Such was the noticeable presence of this demographic group in the city that John Loocock, a British merchant residing there between 1808 and 1818, observed that a foreigner crossing Rio at noon was likely to feel that he had been suddenly transported to the heart of Africa. Blacks stationed themselves on street corners to rent out their services. The majority worked as porters. This job was especially attractive to freed slaves who, after being deprived of any urban trade skills while laboring in plantations, found that soliciting work on the streets was their only avenue for survival. Most of the Black men and women who populate Debret's place in his second volume dutifully carry something on their heads or shoulders, like you can see here. In fact, the two Black figures in the center left of the plate have their arms around each other, which intends to show that enslaved people are happy in their work and go about their tasks in a content manner. The fact that Blacks undertook most of the trade business on the streets explains the rare appearance of whites in many of these vistas. Debret said that white women in particular rarely left their homes in order to avoid the sight of so many semi-nude Black men and women on the streets, especially the laundresses roaming the streets of Rio. Now, I'm going to go briefly about the pictures and the cartographic tradition in these plates. So the question here is, if Debret was trained as a neoclassical painter, why he used the picturesque to chronicle Brazilian imperial history? In the visual arts, the term picturesque was first associated with the landscape tradition established by a French painter, Claude Lorrain, in the 17th century. Lorrain's templates also inspired the work of British amateur printmaker and promoter of picturesque travel, William Gilpin, who articulated a complete theory of aesthetics on the principle of the picturesque, which he described as, and I quote, that particular quality which makes objects chiefly pleasing in painting, end of quote. Gilpin found in the picturesque a middle category that falls in between the beautiful and the sublime, since it lacks the ideal perfection of the beautiful and the awe-inspiring quality of the sublime. Based on the neoclassical idea of the capability of the artist to embellish nature, Gilpin equally developed the notion of the adorned sketch, proposing the creation of an orderly arrangement where all parts could work in harmony to form a whole. The picturesque intent on achieving harmony, combined with his promise of an always unfulfilled aesthetic pleasure, helped cast the colonized world as an allegorical realm. And this is one of my arguments, how the picturesque was very fitting to the colonized world, because it's an allegorical world where its frequent conflicts would be smoothed out, and most importantly, where colonizers could project their fruits of their imagination. Accordingly, the sketchy essence of the picturesque was suited to the improvised and documentary purposes of Debret's albums. Another component of picturesque travel illustrations stem from the visual paradigms generated by the transatlantic voyages begun in the 16th century, which prescribe accurate geographical and geological data, the rendition of cartographies of coastal lines, and the detailed information about local inhabitants and the possibilities of cultivation along the exploitation of resources. Many of the albums published in the 19th century that follow Alexander von Humboldt's 30 volumes titled Voyage de Humboldt et de Bonpland contain a mixture of the scientific and the picturesque. This concorded amalgam enthroned itself in the 19th century as the visual template for the representation of foreign lands. And lastly, The cartographic tradition developed a method of illuminating maps, and again, Bárbaro is an expert on these maps from the 17th century, and I learned a lot of it from him. This tradition of illuminating maps with symbolic human, you can see it here in the cartouche of the maps, with symbolic human allegorical figures to denote the places being represented, and so the viewer could recognize the inhabitants of distant territories. These figurines, identifiable by their dress and attributes, such as those of a particular trade, customary adornments, and so on, became useful for ethnographic albums and travel volumes because the figures could instantly connect geographical places to paradigmatic human types. Now, so these are the visual sources for Debret, and this is the last section of the paper, Haitianism, Slavery, and the Organic Society. Debret's Blacks in Rio de Janeiro function as synecdochic figurines standing for the whole country, a pictorial strategy that disregarded more accurate descriptions of the cultural, religious, and ethnical differentiations between the different African groups brought to Brazil. Mimicking the representational methods formerly employed in cartography, Debret inserted slaves and free Blacks and mulattoes alike in an allegorical world, not only devoid of the original context of the slave's experience, but also free from social conflict. This iconographical maneuver helped mitigate the fears associated with the lingering effects of the Haitian Revolution in Brazil. And I'm finishing with this idea. These fears were not unfounded, as several uprisings had already occurred and motionless was rumored. The urban streets of Brazil were far from being the peaceful workplace that Debret depicted in his volumes. In April 1814, the white merchants of Bahia wrote a petition to then Prince Regent João VI, urging him to dictate measures that would address the slave revolts that were becoming increasingly violent. The signatories made two references to the Haitian Revolution and expressed their concerns that this city could become another Haiti. Haitianism, enveloping any threat of social revolt by the Blacks, became a popular word in Brazilian press after the country declared its independence from Portugal in 1822. According to scholars, in Rio de Janeiro, which had one of the largest colored populations in the country, efforts to control African slaves and free Brazilian-born Blacks and mulattoes were relentlessly enforced. The iron collar punishment for runaway slaves shows 5 slaves in the streets of Rio selling merchandise while wearing shackles on different parts of their bodies. Look at the softness of the hatching, the curvilinear movements of the outlines, and above all, the arabesque forms of the neck collars, drawn in a fashion that rather, okay, I
am so excited that we are going to have a conversation about all of these things. I just want to make sure that we have enough time to hear from Professor Rojo Robles Miejas, and then we can have a discussion. We have 35 minutes left, and we still have one presentation to hear. So thank you very much, Professor Iliana Cepero Amador. And I would now like to introduce Professor Rojo Robles Miejas from Baruch College, faculty in the Department of Black and Latino Studies. His talk is called One Size Fits All, Scenographic Poetics in Pietro Pietre's Condoms Poems for Sale. As a reminder, you are very welcome to add your questions to the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen, and we will have a conversation at the end of this if we're lucky. Thank you very much, and welcome, Professor Robles Miejas.
Thank you, Shelly. Thank you, Ana Maria. Thank you, Hugo. Thank you, all the people at LaGuardia and National Endowments. And thank you, Bárbaro. And thank you, Iliana, for such fascinating presentations. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. So let me start by sharing my screen. All right. So To explore the still growing Pedro Pietri papers at the Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños, Hunter College, is an awe-inspiring and imposing endeavor. The approximately 80 boxes are far from being only papers. The repository includes a vast array of materials, traditional manuscript, handwritten, type, or word processed, cut-ups and scraps, photographs, reel-to-reel audio tapes, videotapes, vinyl, cardboard artifacts, sculptures made with found objects, painted briefcases, among many other mutant gadgets. The versatility of the objects in the archives denotes Pietri's complexity and layer embodiments as a poet, playwright, performer, and reverendo de la Iglesia de la Madre de los Tomates. Unfortunately, this wealth of innovative work clearly at the forefront of disciplines such as performance arts and assemblage is usually not found or referenced in any leading arts institution. His name and work remain, for the most part, embedded and discussed within his own Puerto Rican community and by the marginalized scene of late 20th century experimental poets. Throughout his life, Pietri was involved in a range of eccentric textual, vocal, and corporeal practices. As poet and scholars of Nuyorican poetry, Urayoan Noel argues, Pietri works brings together, and I quote, a number of seemingly incommensurable personae, forms, voices, and discourses in self-reflective performances that underscores the interdependence of identity. From irreverent downtown anarchism to fluid nationalism to Dada surrealism, Pietri's sui generis and always humorous act play with the blurred visibility of diaspora, end of quote. His self-sustainable ethos and poetics open up a discussion about the invisibility of Puerto Rican letters and thus towards conceptualist and experimental horizons. Among the projects from the Pedro Pietri papers I was most interested in were a series of manila envelopes with typed poems on them and condoms inside. I felt impacted by the gesture of extending the notion of sexual protection to poems and proposing a life-saving purpose to both. To analyze the condom poems artifact, I needed to explore the hundreds of pages of the out-of-order manuscript, the main source Pietri used to create his condom packets. This crucial work he did during the AIDS crisis stood out to me as a noteworthy aspect of his archive that needed to be exposed and brought to a larger audience. One of the very few artifacts that I examined was a series of paper sculptures with typed and written poems on them. I noticed that a thematic pattern could be discerned. The poems were about raunchy sexual dynamics and bohemianism, substance use, alcoholic deliriums, and critiques of US capitalism. Although Pietri did not seem interested in making these divisions, in my 2019 Lost and Found edition of the Condom Poems for Sales, One Size Fits All, I decided to compile a representative selection of them based on these flexible and juxtaposed categories. The Lost and Found edition, through an unpublished selection, offers an entry point into his boundless production and this specific iteration of his sex advocacy activism. For me, Condom Poems for Sales, One Size Fits All underlines the ways Pietri manifested with streetwise humor the pleasures and confusion of mind-altering experiences and sexual terrors. The condom poems derive initially from an ever-evolving Rent a Coffin, 1961 onwards, performance in which Pietri, as an undertaker, reflected on mortality based on his painful Vietnam War experiences as a soldier and those of combatant families dealing with lost ones. In this performance, as in other poems and plays, Pietri's conception of time is not linear, but cyclical. Hence, he boldly claimed that sex overcomes death. And I'm gonna quote Pietri now. I started renting coffin back in 1968 because I felt I could help out society by reducing the financial burden individuals are confronted with when a loved one dies. And because I sincerely believe that there is sex after death, all the coffins I rent come with 3 condoms compatible to your complexion. The material is as unpredictable as death. I have been polishing up my coffin for over 15 years now. Everyone feels good about dying after my performance and immediately go home to try out the condoms with their companion. end of quote. As this quote from the 80s suggests, his Undertaker routine of spoken word poems and interaction with the audience was partly memorized and partly improvised, and it was always open for changes. As Urayoan Noel points out, this performance took on an uncanny dimension during the AIDS crisis. As was very common with Pietri, his ideas on safe sex crossed over from one project to the other, including the aforementioned manuscript Out of Order. In effect, what I call here the condom poems were a set of conceptual performances derived for the most part from Out of Order that played with visual elements, spoken word, the renting of coffin, and the creation and distribution of prize envelope with text and prophylactics. During my work in the archive, I noticed how Pietri constantly branched out the content to all sorts of formats, from live presentation to radio and cabaret shows. It was truly an elastic concept that allowed Pietri to employ his interdisciplinary intuition and powers. Out of Order, the dispersed self-published or partially anthologized assortment consists of close to 3,000 short poetic texts or epigrams. In the self-descriptive poem titled Telephone Booth Number 0, Pietri calls them, and I'm gonna quote him, anti-prose conversation in non-alphabetic impromptu numerical free-verse disorder, end of quote. Indeed, the poems were written without any metric or punctuation mark, and although there are clear threads, the manuscript emphasizes chaos, saturation, and disarrangement. The Out of Order collection elevates the art of imagined monologues recorded in the spur of the moment, using concise formats such as the telephone voice message, the tape recorder note to self, and bizarre witticism. Pietri spread poetic insight, humor, and social awareness in many formats, while documenting dark times in New York City.
So I'll read one more poem to more or less summarize what really happens, okay? This is entitled Telephone Booth Number 905. And it's from a series of telephone calls that I made in these phone booths that were out of order. And one night, I was very lonely and I wanted to speak with a lot of people. And I spent like about $20 in dimes. And on my last dime that I lost, I said, the hell with it, I'll speak anyway. And I wrote like a whole collection of poems. And I'll read this one because this is like the best poem of them all. It's entitled Telephone Booth 905.5. Woke up this morning feeling excellent. Picked up the telephone, dialed the number of my equal opportunity employer to inform him I will not be in to work today. Are you feeling sick, the boss asked me. No, sir, I replied. I am feeling too good to report to work today. If I feel sick tomorrow, I will come in very early.
In the course of my research, I had the opportunity to speak with two of Pietri's closest associates, poet, playwright, and lifelong collaborator, Jesus Papoleto Melendez, and the late Puerto Rican photographer, conceptual artist, and comrade in creativity, Adal. When I asked Papoleto about the nature of Pietri's collection, he told me, as the video showed, that it reflected Pietri's habit of calling friends and lovers late at night to encourage long conversation or encounters. He also recalls that Pietri integrated the telephone booth poems to a marijuana advocacy performance, defending ahead of his time open access to the plant. Although he kept framing the curative powers of cannabis and the potential mental expansion of its use, with the AIDS outbreak, Pietri changed and expanded the content of the poems and the envelopes from joints to condoms. While the government's responses have changed through time, during the 80s, the official war against AIDS was articulated by attaching the disease to alien others. The illness was demonized, as well as the patients and their community. The war on AIDS is a war against the individual and the dangers he, she, they represent within mainstream US society. The ill are put into a risk group of community of outcasts. Moreover, they're exposed to harassment, persecution, or plain desertion. As a member of the Nuyorican and Bohemian Poets Fellowship, Pietri was aware of the otherization of the at-risk communities he belonged to or moved through. In conversation with...
So I read one more poem to more or less summarize.
1 second, I'm gonna change here we are. In conversation with Adal, he explained to me that Pietri would sell, and I quoting him, condoms inside a small manila envelope for $1 with the poem written on it to those interested. In some performance entitled Self-Poetry, he also carried a condom cross to parks, public and private spaces where he will set up, remove a condom from its package, place it around the head of a microphone and proceed to read his poem. After the reading, he threw out condoms to the audience, end of quote. In the 1990s, Adal created a portrait of the poet dressed in a fake tuxedo beside his condom cross. Eventually, this photo became a postcard on the online cover of the Pedro Pietri papers. I consider this photograph a reminder of the need to centralize the condom poems within Pietri's long poetic and artistic career. In the selection I edit, sex, death, mind trips, and isolation are intertwined. He warns that socializing can be fatal and that it is no longer safe to screw every place. He says that to avoid the danger, perhaps it's better to go to the movies, to get a VCR, to masturbate, to imagine love's escapades, and especially to wear a condom. Along with the observation about risky, although many times funny, sexual behaviors, the poems also shed light without moralizing on the abuse of alcohol and drugs. Today, I want to highlight 3 poems that did not make it into the chapbook, but that demonstrate Pietri's cinegraphic poetics, a conceptual framework that I'm expanding into a book project about intermediate Puerto Rican poetry in the US. When I use the term cinegrafía, I'm tracing the way cinema informs poetics. Cinegraphy is the technique of utilizing film as intertext and beyond that as an intermodal writing tool. These intermediate poetic pieces are distinct in their use of filmic modes. In the poem I am analyzing here, Pietri engages in a writing practice in which he examines and questions cinema as mass media and as a poetic inspiration. Even though Pietri wrote screenplays and worked as a script consultant, in this text, the poet does not represent himself as a cinephile interested in collected symbolic currency. While cinema is a recurrent topic of Out of Order, the condom poems, Pietri does not refer to any specific film director or actor. That is not the case with poets. For instance, he documents the presence of many poets then active in New York City, such as Amiri Maraca, Entosaki Sanch, or Jorge Brandon, to name a few. With performative contempt, and I say performative here because Jesus Papoleto Melendez recount in a recent interview with One Leaf Press how they will frequently visit art house cinemas in Manhattan. Pietri conceived of mass media as deceiving bullshit that harms a poet's life. This interpretation is notable in telephone booth number 65803. Newspaper headlines, radio, and television, VCR and video games, and word processors too. The media bullshit jive. If you expect to survive without pros, get rid of those interventions. You stick to the invention of what is already poetry. End of quote. What Pietri considers poetry does not include the press, radio, or audiovisual media. Ironically, by mentioning them, the cultural industry, if we use Theodore Adorno's concept, do become part of his poetics. However, Pietri understands poetry as a conceptual and corporeal laboratory and as an ethos. He does not ignore media intervention in our collective psyche and poetry generally speaking, but his poetic voice rebels against technology, the entertainment industry, and news cycle. If we follow the recurrent messages in other poems of the collection, his poetics are defined by an altered sensorium influenced by alcohol, weed, and sex. Street dwelling and daily hustles are also central themes in this poetic experimentation. A question that also emerges when reading and analyzing this poem is also to what extent Pietri was questioning the increasing popularity and commercialization of slam poetry and how media conglomerates such as MTV and HBO were showing interest and or profiting from slam in the 80s and early 90s. In other poems from Out of Order Condom Poems, he does not attack movies in such a category way, but he continues to satirize it as a medium. In Telephone Booth number 73, for example, the poetic voices argued with irony. The movie was so boring that we saw the picture several times before leaving. End of poem. The contradictory statement is key to understand the poem joke. These poetic spectators get bored watching a film in a movie theater, but they cannot escape from it. The concept of repetition could be interpreted here as a way to underscore narrative stereotypes. A film is never an isolated piece, especially within the commercial mediascape. It is always embedded in narrative or mise-en-scene formulas. From this perspective, the spectator is always watching the same movie over and over again. Up to a certain point, the opposite interpretation is possible, even though the spectator thought that they were going to see a formulaic film. The movie ends being so good or stimulant that the spectators rewatch it several times. However, Out of Order Condom Poems propose more times than not a disenchantment with the film medium and cinematographic discourses. In Telephone Booth number 992, we find what we could identify as a definition of his cinegraphia in Out of Order Condom Poems. And I'm gonna quote the whole poem. You go to the movies, you sit down on a chair, you wait for the picture to appear on the screen. You scratch your nose to kill time while you wait. 72 hours later, you are still scratching your nose and have not seen anything on the motion picture screen. You get uptight and complain to the manager, who is also scratching his nose along with everybody else who came to the movies. The manager informs you that the theater opens early in the morning and closes late at night. And if you want to see something on the screen, you have to close your eyes. End of poem. With this poem, Pietri keeps describing the experience of bored spectators trapped in a movie theater over an extended period. After 72 hours, the spectators are not able to see anything on the screen. They protest, thus the theater manager reveals the trick to see something projected. To see, it is recommended that the audience close their eyes, signifying that the movie only exists in the spectator's mind. Here, Pietri shares French philosopher Jacques Rancier's ideas on what he calls emancipated spectators. Rancière proposes these figures to explain active spectatorship, meaning that the sense of a piece of art comes from the mental efforts of the audience. He argues that the power of emancipated spectators resides in their association and disassociation. The spectators link what they see to what they have seen, said, done, and dreamed. The film and any art piece for that matter only come into existence once the spectator creates a mental network of narratives, reasonings, opinions, imaginative spin-off, among other phenomena. Without this complex and layered process of mental configuration, cinema does not exist. Regardless of the invisibility of his work vis-a-vis mainstream culture and the difficulties of accessing Pietri largely out-of-print books, Reverend Pedro's visions has permeated contemporary Puerto Rican, Latinx, and US poetry, especially in its intermediality. Aware of the process of social obliteration and artistic marginalization he was embedded in, Pietri always acknowledged his responsibility to his people and the importance of owning a voice and spreading the word of those out of. I'm using out of here to identify those people and groups made invisible by the state, and also those whose creative work does not fit within the commercial models of publishing, theatrical, or audiovisual powerhouses. As he self-analyzes in the poem that opens the collection I edited, we'll know that Reverend Pedro's poems and plays, and I'm gonna quote him, are all poignant and pricking. His social satire is substantial and sticking. His perspective is pithy and funny and greedy. His outlook's audacious, defiant, and witty. End of quote. That applies to his scenographic works as well. El Reverendo Pedro, his poetic persona, was a modern prophet figure who spoke truth to power and who challenged the hegemony of mass media and the hierarchies and respectable politics of the publishing and film industries. For Pietri, it was more interesting or perhaps more accessible to create mental movies than real ones. In his poems, he portrayed what was happening around him, the world on the street, its images, and helped his audience and readers take far-reaching imaginative journeys. Pietri promoted mental transformation and represented a guardian figures in various senses. He occasionally sold, but mostly gave condoms away to promote sexual health and the prolongation of life. He self-published his poems and performed joyously as El Reverendo Pedro for the cultural and spiritual enrichment of Puerto Ricans and anyone open to the experience. For Pietri, all of this came together as a unified whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rojo. Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists, Bárbaro, Martínez Ruiz, Iliana, Cepero, Amador, and Rojo Robles Miejas. Thank you. We do have 15 minutes for questions, and please, everyone, participants, please add your questions to the Q&A, which you can see on the bottom of your screen. I'm going to check now to see if we have any questions coming in.
It is possible to turn on my camera.
Yes, you just hit the camera button on your.
Yeah, it doesn't. Okay, now, okay.
There you go. Hello, it's nice to see your face. Well, as we're waiting for questions to come in, I'm just going to ask a very broad one that hopefully each of you can take a moment to answer, especially in relation to your work and the interventions that your different works are making. What I noticed in this panel presentation is that your conversations about art and visual works and aesthetics moves across time and space, and is of course very, very much interdisciplinary. And I wonder how you understand not just your methods, but the impact of your work informing what EVC Jose Luis Cruz was calling the decolonization of the curriculum, or for our purposes, the decolonization of knowledge.
Rojo, you want to go first? Or Iliana?
Okay. Well, you know, it's interesting, Shelly, your question, because the final part of my paper was how the Debret's legacy is so much alive in Brazil today. And Debret is seen as this, almost like this father figure in Brazil, a very valuable painter who chronicled the development of Brazil in the 19th century. And and even on Google, you can find kids today, I mean, 2 years ago, drawing images inspired by Debret's album. So his work is mandatory, almost mandatory in some Brazilian schools, because this work illustrates history textbooks in Brazil. So when I was talking to a friend of mine who is an art historian and curator from Brazil about this, he said, well, we haven't even realized how problematic Debret's work is. And how problematic his comments on slaves and the Blacks are yet. So it's a process that we need to initiate. And he, when he read the article, the essay, he said, well, this is a conversation that hasn't been initiated yet in many sectors of Brazilian culture, because still we're very much influenced by French thought. And he was part of the French mission in Rio de Janeiro, and still France holds a lot of value for Brazilians. So that was a very interesting comment he made about this. And I want to give time for Rojo and Bárbaro to give their opinions.
Thank you for that question. In my case, like when talking about Pedro Pietri, we're talking about a person who believed in decolonization, literally, yeah, not symbolically. Pietri was part of the Young Lords, the radical organization of the late 60s and 70s, who believed in armed revolution and who believed and fought, yeah, for the independence of Puerto Rico. So for a while, he was part of that organization, and later on he continued his activism for the independence of Puerto Rico. He constantly wrote about that possibility, and he imagined futures for Puerto Rico through conceptual projects such as the Puerto Rico Embassy, right? That it was precisely about imagining una nación soberana for Puerto Rico, even if it was in its imagination, right? Even if it was an imaginative or conceptual sovereign nation, right? And he also wrote poems again, the presence of the Navy in La Isla de Vieques, for instance, right? So he was also very active in the people's movement in Puerto Rico as well. So he definitely belongs to that tradition of fighting for decolonization for Puerto Rico.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry, for the questions and the answer from Iliana and Rojo. For me, I've been part of this decolonization, decolonizing the curriculum since I was in Cape Town doing the students' movement, student demonstration, and 2014 was the first one, and it happened in 4 years in a row. It's one of the calls from the student was decolonizing the curriculum, because it was organized in a way that didn't represent Black South Africans. That was the first question. And the idea of inclusion was critical in that call. But the second one, I think it had to do in terms of the question about methodology, how we constructed the narrative. If we only cite Western sources, and we don't give space to the local voice from early time to present day, decolonization never will happen. There is not an equal representation if we don't treat the local voice as an equal partner and as the right to tell the story, even if the story could be problematic. And I think that would be my recommendation is when we think about something like history, a discipline like history, we have a very specific way in which we think what constitutes history. They had to do with government documents, for missionary documents, or occupational forces. They have army in place that are collecting data for very specific purposes and go to the stream to the church. And that became the 90% of the quote in historical document come from that particular kind of gathering of data. But we never think about how a person from the Congo made history, what constitutes a history in the Congo sense, or someone in diaspora, how African American can make history through music, body language, through dance, laughing, talking. So there are forms of making history that we exclude because we think they don't have a same footing in terms of value of knowledge in relation to the truth when we write history. And I think that would be the first way to decolonizing. Also is creating a new paradigms and restructuring the data, the collecting data in one hand, so what constitute information, and reorganizing a new methodology that will be equal in that exchange of conversation.
Really great, Bárbaro, and everyone. I'm looking at a question, and your response, Bárbaro, is probably very helpful to the student who's asking about how she wants to be an art historian. This is Kayana Neal. She wants to be an art historian surrounding more of her identity in Latin and Africana historic art, and she's wondering how she can think about approaching art history in a decolonized way, and she's looking for advice. And maybe each of you can offer some advice for future scholars in Latinx and Latin American studies, especially in art history.
I think it's we are kind of facing a crisis in a way in the field in our history of African art and African diaspora in a way. We think there is a revival and a renaissance of Afro-Latin American art, but I don't think it's true. I think is what is happening is the main discipline of our history is absorbing in their own term what used to be African art and now used to be Caribbean and Latin American art. That is what I think has happened. You look into 10 years ago, used to be more than 25, 30 full-time professors of African art in the country. Now we are only five, six of them in the whole country that can teach. You have a decision being made in the university about hiring a professor who can teach African art and African diaspora. That means is translate for African diaspora as someone who works with photography or contemporary art, contemporary practice. And historical art is something that is before the 20th century. It's become something that, like old school. It's not important, it's not critical. And now we have a disconnect between historical African art, historical Caribbean and Latin American art with contemporary practices. And the second problem is there are not a lot of people that can train someone in the field of African art, African diaspora, or Afro-Latin American art. There are programs that have the title, but when you look into the curriculum, they're just studying history, political science, political history, but no, visual culture, no art history. Anthropology maybe would be a minor component. All the African programs in the country, they are, social science is the main discipline that ruled those programs, not just in the US, everywhere in the world. That means we had to kind of change the dynamic.
Absolutely. We have 3 minutes before we go back into a musical segment. And so I'm going to turn to Maria Josefina Caneno Arroyo, and she has a question about specific recommendations about decolonizing the humanities curriculum in Latin American Latinx studies, particularly at CUNY. And this might be actually another great segue from Barbaro's comments, so that maybe Iliana and Rojo might have something to say about how they see the future that Bárbaro just described as being starved, in that there's not enough faculty training new faculty and training new students. What are your suggestions, if you have any, for how CUNY as an institution and other institutions can correct that problem?
I think that it's important to create coalitions, and faculty students need to work together and demand those changes. Yeah, reading the question, I was also thinking that it's perhaps it might seem that African studies, Black studies, Latinx studies, Afro-Latin American studies are unpopular, but actually if you associate if you start to create associations and create ties with ethnic studies program, that is actually the opposite, right? That's the field. And if we want to increase the visibility of ethnic studies, we need to work together. We need to also to create a momentum, right? And to create presence in every single platforms, and also establish connections and dialogues with the administration in order to promote, more classes, more courses, more perspective within ethnic studies, and also defend ethnic studies as a whole.
You. That's great with the theme of this NEH-sponsored conference today, Building Bridges. We have, I think, 40 seconds left. And Iliana, do you want the last word?
Well, I think Bárbaro and Rojo have spoken very eloquently about these challenges and possible solutions. On my part, I teach courses on Latin American art, post-colonial theory. I teach a whole course on Black philosophers of the Caribbean, Black thinkers like the Haitians, the Martinicans, Frantz Fanon, etc. So this is my contribution to this decolonizing curriculum. And the students always respond very positively to this, because they find that the curriculum is very Eurocentric in many American universities. But I'm hopeful and optimistic that things will change in due time.
Well, thank you everyone for attending this panel today and for coming to this really important conference at LaGuardia Community College, sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And hopefully we will have so many more opportunities to collaborate and learn from each other across the world. Thank you very much to Bárbaro, Iliana, and Rojo Robles. Thank you so much, and have a good afternoon. And we look forward to the next panel and the music.
Thank you, Shelly. Thank you, Rojo and Bárbaro, Hugo and Ana María. Thank you,
Iliana.
everyone.
Thank you, Rojo.
Thank you all.